Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Black families of Revolutionary Era Plymouth County, Massachusetts. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator for today's event. This program is being produced by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we do thank you for your patience. If we were to lose the connection for any reason, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording on our website. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Mary Blauss Edwards. Mary is a historian, genealogist, and author of the upcoming book, Plymouth County, Massachusetts, Free Person Families in 1790. She has written numerous books, lectures, articles, and museum exhibits on early New England history and slavery in early Massachusetts. As the Paul Cuffy Fellow at the Munson Institute of Mystic Seaport, she explored the lives of the sisters, daughters, and nieces of Black Wampanoag businessman and activist Paul Cuffy. She was a researcher for several seasons of the genealogical television shows Who Do You Think You Are? And Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., and she is a former member of the research services team here at American Ancestors. Now, of course, Plymouth's Mayflower families have been well studied, but the biographies of the Black men, women, and children who were enslaved by those families and their descendants are vastly underrepresented in historical research. Today, we will hear some of those stories and the contributions of, again, just some of the enslaved and free Black Revolutionary War soldiers from Plymouth County, Massachusetts. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is no syllabus for this program, but we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from this presentation on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and watch the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Mary.
Thanks so much, Ginevra. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I would like to open my talk today with an Indigenous land and enslaved peoples acknowledgement. Indigenous land acknowledgements are commonly given before public speaking events in Canada, both before academic and even sporting events. They've grown in popularity to open educational events in the United States as a way to honor and recognize Native stewardship of the land on which we gather. In the US, these acknowledgements have expanded to include recognition of how Black lives have shaped these same spaces. In pre-COVID times, my focus would be about the physical space where we were gathered together. But today I will speak about the history of the land and community where our host, NEHDS, stands, and encourage everyone listening today to learn more about the Indigenous and Black history of your home communities. NEHDS is located in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood on backfilled soil which covered over waterways of the Massachusetts tribe. Generations of native-built fish weirs lie under the streets here, and today Massachusetts and Wampanoag leaders host an annual ancient fish weir celebration, an educational event a few blocks over from HisGen on Boston Common. It's awesome. I highly recommend attending once it is safe to gather again. Today's webinar is focused on Plymouth County, Massachusetts, located on the traditional land of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag people of the past, present, and future. They continue to steward the land as sovereign tribal nations. I encourage you to research your local Indigenous tribe's history and follow your local Indigenous authors, social media, activists, educators, and businesses. Let's also recognize and remember the enslaved people of Massachusetts and their descendants who built the cities and wealth of Boston and Plymouth. Black organizers, both enslaved and free, were central to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts and the quest for justice to the present day. Their stories deserve to be better known and understood, despite their systemic erasure. I encourage you to add more local Black businesses, nonprofits, community leaders, and activists from your home communities into your routine education and spending. I'll include links at the end of this webinar with suggestions for Massachusetts Native and Black historical organizations to support. Thank you so much for gathering with me today, and let us commit to dismantling racism. Before sharing specific biographies of Plymouth area families, I'd like to provide a bit of historical context and outline some important moments of Massachusetts Black history leading up into the Revolutionary era. In 1623, the earliest known Black man to visit Plymouth during the colonial era was enslaved Virginian John Pedro, who arrived in Plymouth aboard the Swan, refueling supplies before a mission to England. Plymouth military leader Miles Standish arrived in Plymouth at the same time, having just horrifically assassinated several Massachusetts Indians who Standish had called together for a diplomatic meeting at what is now called Weymouth. Pedro likely saw the head of a Massachusetts warrior installed on a pike in Plymouth Town Square at the head of Leyden Street, where a decade prior the first Thanksgiving had been celebrated. 44 years later, Plymouth military officials would place the head of Pokanoket leader King Philip in the same spot as a threat to local Indian and Black residents of Plymouth Colony. In 1638, the Boston ship Desire brought the first Black slaves to sell at market to Boston from Bermuda in exchange for Pequot Indian prisoners of war. In 1641, Massachusetts Bay Colony became the first American colony to legalize slavery of Africans and Native Americans. And several slaves were already members of Massachusetts churches by that time, so the law specified that church membership did not exempt anyone from enslavement. In 1643, an unnamed Black Plymouth resident was included in a militia list. In 1644, Boston merchants began importing slaves directly from Africa. From the 1650s to the 1690s, Black slaves began appearing in Plymouth Colony court cases. In 1670, Massachusetts Bay Colony legalized the inheritable enslavement of children born to enslaved women. From 1672 to 1696, Massachusetts merchants began smuggling slaves through small coastal towns to avoid taxation from the crown. In 1674, Captain Thomas Willett of Marshfield's probate included 8 slaves valued at 200 pounds. In 1676, Massachusetts slave population was about 200 people. Boston merchants were then granted an exclusive slave trade with Madagascar, which expanded the acquisitions of enslaved people. In 1692, Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay colonies combined into the province of Massachusetts Bay, and their laws became the same regarding slavery. In 1703, a law required Massachusetts slave owners to post bonds for all slaves in case masters refused to care for them and to prevent them from becoming charges to town budgets. 1705, interracial marriage was banned after several interracial marriages had been performed in Plymouth County, including between Welsh woman Margaret Jones and former slave Frank of Hanover, and former slave James Newell and white woman Mary White of Scituate. In 1706, a tax on imported slaves encouraged slave owners to purchase women who would birth enslaved children rather than pay taxes on newly imported African slaves. In 1708, the estimated slave population of Massachusetts was 550 people, and in 1715 rose to 2,000 people. Boston criminal statutes increased against Black citizens from the 1720s to the 1750s, forbidding grocery purchases, carrying walking sticks or canes, keeping livestock, and curfews began being enforced, which were punishable by physical lashings. Black soldiers served in Massachusetts colonial militias in King George's War and the French and Indian War. Afterwards, Black veterans began to lead a growing abolition movement in the state. George Washington refused to accept Black soldiers at the start of the Revolutionary War despite existing Black military service in the Massachusetts Army. The British Army then promised freedom to enslaved Black soldiers, and an estimated 200,000 Black soldiers joined the British Army and were later offered residence in Canada and known as Black Loyalists. Washington begrudgingly responded by allowing already freed Black men who had already previously served in the military to enlist, a restrictive limit. Many colonies, desperate for soldiers, then encouraged slave owners to privately arrange manumissions to be paid with military bounties, such that the soldiers could technically be free at enlistment. An estimated 9,000 Black soldiers served in the Patriot Army. In 1780, Massachusetts adopts a new constitution. John Adams included Article 1's Declaration of Rights, which stated, "All men are born free and equal." From 1781 to 1783, enslaved women and men Elizabeth Freeman, Brom, and Quock Walker won their freedom suits out of slavery. Massachusetts Chief Justice William Cushing confirmed that the 1780 Constitution had abolished slavery in Massachusetts. Since this was a constitutional ruling instead of a law, some Massachusetts slave owners did not immediately free their slaves. But by the 1790 first federal census, Massachusetts was the only state in the country without enslaved people. Numerous Black families owned their own houses for the first time, many through wages earned in the Revolutionary War. Massachusetts native tribes were not enumerated in this first census since they were considered sovereign nations and not American citizens. And throughout the 1790s, Black Massachusetts residents fought for the expansion of civil rights, Black education, home and business ownership, and total abolition. This is only a small collection of significant historical moments in Massachusetts Black history, and I encourage you to add more books to your bookshelf about early New England Black and Native history. Next, I'd like to share with you several stories about Black and Native families, both enslaved and free people, from my hometown of Plymouth County in the 18th century. Although at times fragmentary, Black and Native history is abundant in early Plymouth primary source records, including court, probate, deeds, military records, newspaper articles, manuscript collections, journals, and oral histories written by descendants of both slave owners and those they enslaved. Many of these families had been enslaved for several generations by descendants of Mayflower and Great Migration immigrants. First, we'll discuss the enslaved family of Toby Talbot and his wife Dinah Gould of West Bridgewater. Toby Talbot went to incredible lengths to try to keep his family unit in proximity to each other, despite the fact that he and his wife were enslaved by different families. Toby's wife and children were inherited and sold off to several families across West Bridgewater and Brockton, while Toby was forced to move from West Bridgewater to Weymouth to Abington and back to West Bridgewater again. Toby was enslaved by Ichabod and Lydia Keith of West Bridgewater. When Ichabod died in 1753, his probate valued Toby at 50 pounds. Toby's surname likely derived from tar pot, a racist nickname that was a reference to his labor in creating tar from pine wood in Keith's woodlots. Toby was responsible for clearing land and farm labor for the Keith family. As a freeman, he preferred the name Talbot or Talbot, as he chose his own surname. Toby married Dinah Gould in 1755 in West Bridgewater. Dinah was enslaved by Deacon Ephraim and Martha Phobes of West Bridgewater. The death of a slave owner was always a dangerous time for those they enslaved. When Deacon Phobes died, Dinah was inherited by his daughter Mary and given permission to marry. Dinah married Toby the day that Deacon Ephraim's probate was filed, and together they had 11 children, all born enslaved. Toby and Dinah could not prevent the sale of several of their children, but they fought to keep their family within traveling distance of each other. Toby was enslaved by Lydia Williams Keith White Jones, who married 3 times, and he was forced to move to different towns with each of Lydia's remarriages. Toby insisted on regular visitation with his wife Dinah. When his daughter Dinah's sale was threatened, he requested that Lydia purchase his daughter so they could live together. But this peace was temporary, and Lydia Jones later sold Toby to Jesse Howard and Dinah Jr. to Elijah Snell of West Bridgewater. Toby fought several tours of duty in the Revolution and used his wages to purchase his freedom and a house. In the spring of 1779, Jesse Hayward contested Toby's freedom and attempted to re-enslave him. When George Washington authorized free black soldiers to enlist in the Patriot Army, Massachusetts slaves like Toby Talbot negotiated the promise of their freedom with their masters. Toby made an arrangement with Howard typical of this technical skirting of the rule. He owed Howard future payment of his wages, and in exchange could enlist in the army as a free man. But since his debt could not actually be paid until he finished his service, he was technically still enslaved while in active service in the war. This was a dangerous legal position, as enslaved veterans such as Toby discovered upon returning home. Money made by slaves was the automatic property of their enslaver. Black slaves had served in the French and Indian War, and their wages were sent to their enslavers, not to the enslaved soldiers themselves. While some enslavers fulfilled their promise and freed their slaves who served in the Revolution, slaves like Toby came home to their masters reneging on the deal. However, Toby Talbot was able to successfully sue his master, and a jury legally confirmed his freedom. In the summer of 1779, Toby then invited his teenage daughters Dinah and Matilda to join him. Toby hoped that his recent lawsuit win would secure freedom for his daughters as well. But Dinah and Matilda's enslavers gathered a mob of violent Bridgewater men who broke into Toby's home and smashed and stole his possessions. There they assaulted, kidnapped, and horrifically re-enslaved Toby's daughters Dinah and Matilda. Toby then hired an abolitionist lawyer on behalf of his daughters Dinah and Matilda. Dinah sued her master Elijah Snell for £2,000 in damages for his assault against her, and submitted heartbreaking testimony at her trial about her kidnapping. Dinah's sister Matilda filed a similar suit against her master Samuel Dunbar. Toby had successfully sued for his personal freedom, and for several years he filed numerous lawsuits on his daughter's behalf, but was unsuccessful in winning their freedom. Since slavery in Massachusetts was matrilineally based, and their mother Dinah had been enslaved at the time of their births, the court did not accept Toby's legal argument that because he was a free man, his daughters could be freed. Toby's family was finally reunited together in 1783, all under the same roof, with the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. He settled with his wife Dinah and his younger children in Brockton, and several of his children, including Dinah Jr., went on to become Black pioneers in the state of Maine. Next, we'll discuss the family of Cuffy Wright and Anna Cordner of Middleborough. Cuffy Wright was enslaved in Middleborough by Congregational minister Reverend Sylvanus Conant, and was later manumitted through Conant's will. His wife Anna had been born free in Brockton, and once widowed from Cuffy, she moved to Carver. Cuffy was enslaved as a child by Middleborough minister Reverend Conant, who had taught Cuffy to read and write. Massachusetts slaves were rarely allowed or provided educational opportunities to become literate, although compared to the South, New England slaves on average were more literate. Ministers were an important part of the reason for this. They were a small category of enslavers who would allow their slaves to read the Bible as part of religious instruction, although writing was still rarely authorized. However, at 19 years old, Cuffy personally authored a unique document which showed that he had likely spent many hours practicing his penmanship. In 1773, Cuffy joined Conant's church with a relation, or a statement of faith, that he had written himself. Reverend Conant was a patriot agitator throughout the Revolutionary War, and Cuffy was a participant in many of Middleborough's patriot gatherings against the loyalist Oliver family. Conant became ill with smallpox during the war and freed Cuffy in his will in 1777. In 1778, as soon as his freedom was granted, Cuffy married Anna Cordner in Brockton. He then enlisted in the Revolutionary War immediately after their wedding. He purchased a house in Middleborough for his family, and in later years helped to care for Anna's elderly father. Former slaves entering a new legal world in Massachusetts following the Revolution experienced an expansion of civil rights, which allowed Cuffy to become a tax-paying homeowner. But as a black man, he was not allowed to vote in Massachusetts elections, despite having just fought an entire war on the motto, "No taxation without representation." His wife, Anna Cordner, had been born in Brockton, the daughter of free black parents, Amos Cordner and Abigail Colley. She married her second husband, Swansea Hart of Carver, a former slave, in the year 1800. Relations were statements of faith that were required by parishioners who wanted to become full members of the Congregational Church. They most commonly survive today as second-hand notes recorded privately by ministers. But Middleborough's collection of relations are unique because they were written directly in the hand of their parishioners. Cuffy and Anna both wrote relations to join the Middleborough Congregational Church, and they joined the church as full members. Black and Native membership in congregational churches was common at this time, although they were typically required to sit in segregated pews at the back of the church. Cuffy and Anna's relation manuscripts, now a part of New England's Hidden Histories project at the Congregational Library in Boston, are rare documents written in their own hands and vernacular. Cuffy's relation is the only document discovered thus far in the collection that was written in an enslaved New Englander's own hand. Here's the first page of the teenage Cuffy's relations. He wrote, "I have such thought of Christ in my mind as sometimes felt very pleasant to me when I was about my calling and my business." Reverend Conant manumitted Cuffy in his 1777 will. He stated that Cuffy has behaved in a good and faithful manner, and I give his freedom and 40 pounds, together with his wearing apparel and the bed and bedding he now useth, the money to be paid to him in 3 months, and the other things delivered to him directly after my decease. Many of the families I have researched from Plymouth County in the Revolutionary era either purchased their own freedom in exchange for their hard-earned army wages, or they were freed against their master's wishes by the 1783 constitutional abolition of slavery. Cuffy Wright is a rarer case. Reverend Conant directly manumitted Cuffy and paid him money, clothing, and bedding to begin his life in freedom. This granted Cuffy more security than many newly emancipated slaves experienced. Massachusetts' abolition of slavery never gained the political willpower to actually pass laws securing the ruling or provide financial support for newly freed Black families who were left to fend for their own economic survival after experiencing a lifetime of enslavement. Cuffy's wife, Anna Wright, did not join the Middleborough Church until after she was widowed. She had been baptized in the Brockton Congregational Church as a child by her parents, and her relation is also unique, a rare relation written by a free Black woman in the 18th century. It is powerful to read her signature today. Next is Matakeesit Indian Violet Quason Osgood of Matakeesit and Hanson. Violet was born in the Matakeesit Indian Reservation in Pembroke. She was the daughter of John and Abigail Quason and the granddaughter of Matakeesit leader Patience Momentog Coombs Thomas. Following a series of tragedies the Matakeesits faced, Violet became a servant of Hanson minister Reverend Gad Hitchcock in 1760. During the 1750s, the Matakeesit tribe in Pembroke lost many adult men to the French and Indian War. Predatory white neighbors and guardians demanded so much debt payment that Violet's grandmother Patience sold off the majority of Matakeesit land to pay outstanding debts. But the reservation had been deeded the previous century as a permanent Indian reservation, never to be sold. The tribe revolted against Patience's leadership and sued to prevent the reservation from being sold. However, the white court sided with selling off the reservation property. Patience was then able to build an English-style house with the sale, but within several years was once again facing so much debt that all of her grandchildren were forced into servitude. In 1760, Violet went to live with Reverend Gad Hitchcock to repay family debts. Although technically Native Americans in the 18th century in Massachusetts were not legally considered slaves, many were forced through poverty to serve as debt peons indefinitely in white houses. Abuse of the Indian debt peonage system and racist attitudes eroded Violet's status as a free Indian woman over the years into enslavement. In 1760, the year that Violet came into the Hitchcock house, Reverend Gideon Hawley of Mashpee reported that the majority of the Mashpee Indians were in forced service with little way of breaking free from the system. Indian women often found that their masters considered them to be de facto slaves and would claim ownership of their children as well. Violet arrived at the Hitchcock household in 1760 already pregnant, and Hitchcock later claimed both Violet and her children as slaves. She had 2 children, Juba and Dinah. Hitchcock complained to Pembroke authorities that Juba was disabled as a teenager and tried to receive reimbursements from the town government from the Pauper Fund, claiming that it was unjust of him to have to pay for medical bills for a slave who could not work. Pembroke rejected the claim, stating that Massachusetts law determined that slave owners were responsible for any costs incurred by a current slave or a slave previously owned by an enslaver. Violet and her daughter Dinah determined themselves to leave Hitchcock's house after learning that the Massachusetts Constitution established that, quote, all men are born free and equal. Hitchcock filed a long complaint with the Massachusetts court and requested reimbursement for his financial loss. After a decade and a half of enslavement, Violet returned to Mattakeesit, where she tended to her elderly mother Abigail and grandmother Patience, who both died soon after her return. Violet then married former slave Puffer London in 1786, a widow whose previous wife Alice was half black and half Massachusetts Indian. Violet then purchased a home for her family in Marshfield. In the 1790 census, Violet London is one of the few Native Americans enumerated in Plymouth County due to the fact that indigenous tribes were sovereign nations and not considered American citizens. Therefore, families living on Plymouth County reservations in Indian communities such as Assawamsett in Lakeville, Titicut in Middleborough and Bridgewater, and Herring Pond in Plymouth were not included in the census. However, Native and Black marriages increased throughout the 18th century, so the federal census often included indigenous people who were married to Black householders and excluded Black spouses who resided on Native reservations. Here's a clip of Reverend Gad Hitchcock's petition, in which he complains that Violet and her daughter Dinah claimed the right of being born free, equal, and independent, and they left the service of your petitioner. Next, we'll discuss the community of parting ways of Plymouth and Kingston, which consisted of the families and descendants of Quason Philip Conde, Plato and Rachel Turner, Cato and Althea Howe, and Prince and Nellie Goodwin. Here's a map of the Parting Ways community located on the border of Kingston and Plymouth in the early 19th century. You can see here where each of the families settled. Numerous Plymouth County Black families purchased their own homes and private property after the war, typically within their own home communities and often interspersed with white neighbors. But the Parting Ways community was different in several significant ways. Parting Ways itself is located on Plymouth Common Lands, which was public town land that was used to graze sheep. The town government of Plymouth authorized the Black residents of Parting Ways to legally own their own homes and clear the land, but they never actually authorized the land itself to any individual family's private ownership. Although this was a precarious position, over time the community flourished throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Other Black Plymouth County families who achieved home ownership after the war faced ever-encroaching racist and predatory loans, which caused many families to lose their properties within a generation or two following the war. But although the Parting Ways community could not build generational wealth by actually owning the land at Parting Ways, their ability to use the property as they saw fit created a unique Black community for over a century and a half. Parting Ways was the focus of an archaeological dig for the bicentennial, and featured in archaeologist James Dietz's book, In Small Things Forgotten. Dietz was captivated by the life of Black resident Cato Howe and framed his chapter about parting ways around Howe. However, it was actually Quash Conde who was the true heart of the Black community at Parting Ways. Quash had been enslaved by Dr. Lazarus LeBaron, who had been a part of the Plymouth Committee which examined the murky legal status of the Plymouth sheep pasture and common lands. This was how Quash learned about the legal loophole concerning Parting Ways, which had previously allowed poor white families to settle on the pasture without actually owning the land. And so upon his manumission, Quash then moved to Parting Ways himself and became the first Black settler there. Numerous new discoveries were made about the Parting Ways families, their origins, and their relationships to one another. I'll highlight just a few here. Although previously thought to be born in Africa, Quash Conde was actually born at 32 Middle Street in Plymouth, the son of Quamini and Duchess, African slaves of Captain Thompson and Hannah Cotton Phillips. Captain Phillips was washed overboard while on a slave trade mission, and his house became the center of a haunted house controversy. The house was rented after Captain Phillips' death, and a rent dispute led to claims that tenants had witnessed the ghost of Captain Phillips and several other supernatural sights. After Captain Phillips' death, Quash was sold as a child to Plymouth minister Reverend Josiah Cotton, and then later to Plymouth physician Dr. Lazarus LeBaron of Leyden Street. Quash married Phyllis in 1756. Phyllis was likely the granddaughter of Wampanoag leader Ralph Jones. Phyllis's mother Mary married Quash's father Quamini in 1732. Mary had been an Indian servant to Reverend Josiah Cotton, and Phyllis's status, like Violet's, also changed from Indian servant to slave once she was given to Reverend Cotton's son, Theophilus Cotton, as a wedding gift. Newly identified children of Quash and Philip included Quash, Cato, Quamini, and Catherine. LeBaron descendant author Jane Austen, not that Jane Austen, wrote that Dr. LeBaron attempted to force Quash Conde to change his name to Julius Caesar when he first arrived at the LeBaron house as a boy in the 1730s. Quash fought to keep his name, which had been gifted to him by his African parents Quamini and Duchess. Quashi deriving from Quasi, meaning child born on Sunday, and Conde deriving from Conde, meaning firstborn child. Quash would not relinquish his name. Dr. LeBaron punished him by sending him to bed without food, beating him, and he bribed him with an old soldier's hat, which Quash refused to accept. Quash Conde kept his birth name. Quash was the first Black resident at Parting Ways, and his wife Phyllis and several of his children joined him later upon their manumissions. Several new discoveries about the families who joined there of the Turner, Howe, and Goodwin families included the identification of a previously unknown daughter of Plato Turner. His daughter Judith migrated to Sierra Leone aboard Captain Paul Cuffy's ship the Traveler. She died of fever shortly after arriving in Africa. Cato Howe's parentage and family has been identified. He was likely the son of Quash and Philip Conde. Cato and his wife Althea had a daughter Phyllis, who was born in 1778, who suffered from seizures and died young. And Prince Goodwin was likely the son of Hagar, who had been enslaved by Dr. Lazarus LeBaron. His biography is the most misrepresented in previous writings. New signage has been recently installed at the Parting Ways Memorial site. I definitely recommend you go for a socially distanced visit when it is safe to do so. And finally, let's discuss the family of James Easton and his wife Sarah Dunbar of Brockton. James Easton was born free in his parents' house on the Titicut Indian Reservation, the son of free Black parents Caesar Easton and Mercy Gundaway. His wife Sarah Dunbar had been born in Randolph. Following their marriage, they lived in Brockton and attended churches in Brockton and Avon. James Easton was the grandson of one of Plymouth's earliest enslaved families, Richard and Mingo Gundaway, who were Plymouth Church's first Black members and who had been manumitted in 1711. In 1732, Richard and Mingo leased and were later gifted 90 acres by the Titicut Indians on the Titicut Reservation in Middleborough. James Easton worked in Middleborough iron forges when he was a young man, and later established his own forge operated with his sons. He served in the Revolutionary War and then married Sarah Dunbar in 1783 and purchased a house in Brockton. Sarah Dunbar was born free in 1756 in her father's house in Randolph. She was the daughter of free Black parents Sampson Dunbar and Patience Crouch. Her stepmother was a Black teacher who educated Sarah, and Sarah likely continued the tradition and taught her own children how to read and write. By the early 1800s, Massachusetts towns typically had several small one-room school buildings in each populated neighborhood. Like churches at the time, Plymouth area schools were often integrated with both white and Black students, although many poor Black children could not afford to regularly attend. The Easton's family's experiences of racism from their white neighbors led to their disillusionment with the quality of their children's education and led to James's creation of a school for young Black men. James and Sarah had 7 children together. James Easton became Plymouth County's wealthiest Black businessman in the early 19th century. He was viewed by Black and white associates as a genius. The Eastons and Dunbar families had several prior generations of free Black home ownership, which helped to launch James Easton's earliest businesses. James Easton founded Plymouth County's first Black apprenticeship school, encouraged the creation of other local Black businesses, and built a Black community loan system to protect Black neighbors from predatory loans and lawsuits that Easton himself had already faced. He communicated often with Black Wampanoag businessman Paul Cuffy, who was a mentor to him. Abolitionist William Cooper Nell wrote that the Eastons were victims, however, to the spirit of color phobia then rampant in New England, and were persecuted even to the dragging out of some of the family from the Orthodox Church, where a porch had been erected exclusively for colored people. After this disgraceful occurrence, the Eastons left the church. They afterwards purchased a pew in the Baptist church at Stoughton Corner, which excited a great deal of indignation. Not succeeding in their attempt to have the bargain canceled, the people tarred their pew. The next Sunday, the Easton family carried seats in their wagon. The pew was then pulled down, but the family insisted and sat in the aisle. The Easton's activist work inspired generations of Massachusetts Black and white abolitionists and activists. Black historian William Cooper Nell wrote the following biography of James Easton in his 1855 book, Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. James Easton of Bridgewater participated in the erection of the fortifications on Dorchester Heights under the command of Washington, which the next morning so greatly surprised the British soldiers then encamped in Boston. Mr. Easton was a manufacturing blacksmith, and his forge and nail factory made edge tools and anchors. It was extensively known for its superiority of workmanship. Much of the ironwork for the Tremont Theater and Boston Marine Railway was executed under his supervision. Mr. Easton was self-educated. When a young man, he always provided for chances of evening study. He was welcomed to the business circles of Boston as a man of strict integrity, and the many who resorted to him for advice in complicated matters styled him the Black Lawyer. His sons, Caleb, Joshua, Sylvanus, and Hosea, inherited his mechanical genius and mental ability. Next up, I've included several links detailing important Massachusetts Black history resources. First up is the Massachusetts African American Trail Project out of Tufts University, which gathers a bunch of Massachusetts important historical sites that you can either go on a driving tour through or you can use digitally. The Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket has wonderful digital resources right now. They've invested a lot of time into collecting amazing stories about local Massachusetts Black residents. The National Park Service, the Boston African American Historic Site, they do walking tours, which are really worth your time if you're ever in downtown Boston. The Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts, about 15 years ago. At that time, they were only interpreting the house in honor of the Isaac Royal family, which was one of Massachusetts' wealthiest white families. But they had an entire back building on the property that had been where the many dozens of slaves that the royal family had owned actually lived separately. And they determined to reinvent their mission statement and instead bring Black history to the forefront, and is just a really incredible example of a museum that has really put Black history to the forefront and center, and I think is a great model for many historical organizations to consider. The Robbins House in Concord is another example of this. It's the Robbins House was owned by a Black family in Concord. Obviously, Concord is the site of a lot of interest in Revolutionary War history, but it has wonderful resources dedicated to local Black historical stories that are just often not told. The Atlantic Black Box Project out of Brown University. Their mission statement is researching and reckoning with New England's role in the global economy of enslavement. They gather data of events and educational experiences all throughout New England dedicated to Black history. I highly recommend giving them a follow if you'd like to be informed of future upcoming events. The Parting Ways Cemetery has a great Twitter at Parting Ways Mass. They often gather a lot of current Black history events and historical essays and articles that have been written. And the Frederick Douglass Neighborhood Association of Brockton, Mass. is just a really interesting example of how you in your local community could be engaging with Black history more. This is a local community-run association that often focuses on local Black history to the town of Brockton, but also engages in a lot of acts of community service to help out their neighbors and to teach Black history. I highly recommend that you follow local Black businesses, nonprofits, land trusts, and historical organizations. Please support their community initiatives. And if you're curious about where to start of where your local Indigenous tribes are, I highly recommend checking out Whose Land Do I Live On, which is native/land.ca, which is a good place to start to see incredible maps and a lot of historical research that have been gathered by Indigenous tribes telling their own histories that allow you to learn more about the local land where you are on. And also here are some links up on the page for the websites of each of the local Massachusetts and Wampanoag tribes. And at the end there's a link for the Ancient Fishware Project that I mentioned at the start. Please follow your local Indigenous tribes and support their community initiatives as well. Coming soon to publication is my upcoming book through NEHDS, Plymouth County, Massachusetts Free Person Families in 1790, which provides biographies of the 28 Black families who were enumerated as homeowners in the 1790 census. All of the families mentioned today receive full chapters with many more details than I had time to cover here. I hope you found the stories I shared today interesting, and they all deserve to be better known. Thank you so much for your attendance today. It's been my pleasure. And now let's open it up for questions from the audience. If you have any additional questions, feel free to contact me through my social media, email, or blog.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary, so much for that fantastic presentation. As she noted, let's get to some questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type it into the questions panel. So Anne asks, what were some of the sources of the new discoveries that you discussed for the Parting Ways community and families? Where did that information come from? And she also asks, how recently was that sign that you noted installed?
Oh, okay. Those are great questions. Off the top of my head, the sign, I believe the Parting Ways Cemetery group has, I believe they put it up in 2012. Prior to that, at the bicentennial, a new memorial had been installed at the cemetery of Parting Ways, and some hiking trails there have been expanded, but when you had previously showed up at the site, there just really weren't a lot of ways to sort of appreciate and understand the history of what that site was, which is still a large public space. So there's been great write-ups of some of the context and story of the Black residents who had lived there. As far as the new discoveries, so the In Small Things Forgotten book had started a research project in the 1970s that had done some incredible work. They talked to a ton of Black Plymouth residents. They had reached out to descendants of Parting Ways community residents. They'd gathered a lot of oral history, which can still be found at the Plymouth Library and is absolutely incredible. And a lot of the historical records used at that time involved things like military records and some of the easily accessible Plymouth vital records. But of course, since the 70s, there's been just an explosion of primary document access as the internet took off and as just so many record collections have been digitized. It's really opened up a lot of ways into formerly very obscure records that have been a lot harder to find. So a couple of important places where I found new records was a recently digitized, the Reverend Cotton of Plymouth's diary had a lot of narrative stories about some of Quash's origins that were really important to my work. A few types of military records had never been available before that I was really able to dig in. That really helped to illuminate the likely connections of each of the families actually being related by blood to each other, rather than previously a lot of their origins had been simply unknown. Quash's story of his keeping his name comes from a descendant, Jane Austen, who had written the story multiple generations removed. And as with all things oral history, the story is super valuable to include. The kernel of truth was there, but it looked like actually instead it was Quash's father who was the person who had been kidnapped straight from Africa. And so part of that was actually applying to his father's story rather than Quash's story himself. And then additionally, oftentimes in history, sort of men receive more focus than women. So I also tried to spend a lot of time recovering more stories about the daughters and the wives of these families who up until this point might have been previously mentioned quickly, but there were just a lot more records about their experiences to dig into too. So thank you for your question.
And thank you for your answer. So we have a question from Nikki who asks, you mentioned several couples who were married while still being enslaved in different geographic areas. How did they meet and how were they married, either officially or not officially?
Yeah, so an important second part, I had mentioned at the top the 1705 interracial marriage ban, which was the second portion of that law had been thrown in by Judge Samuel Sewell, who added a factor to the law which said that enslaved marriages had to be legally recognized both in the court of law and by church ministers. So this was actually a legal protection that although slaves had no real control over where their owners might choose to sell them, or if there was debts accruing in the white family of the enslavers. There was always a threat of sale, but this law at least allowed enslaved people to be married in a church, have recognition for their children being born together, and allowed some element, particularly in Plymouth, at least, a lot of slave marriages were often people who did grow up knowing each other. They were close by. A lot of the downtown Plymouth homes were wealthy families. Almost every house when you walk in downtown Plymouth had at least several slaves living there over the period of the 1700s. So it was a substantial Black community in downtown Plymouth throughout the 1700s. They would have known each other. They would have worked with each other. They would have, they were allowed legal opportunities to play music in taverns. There's a lot of records of Plymouth. Many Plymouth Black folks were musicians. There's evidence of a lot of fiddle playing and a lot of joy and entertainment in their off days. Puritan law had allowed for Sunday being a day of rest, and that carried forward into Massachusetts law. So slaves in Plymouth were guaranteed Sundays off. There are some stories of in Quash's family. Quash maintained an orchard up in North Plymouth and made his own cider, and was sometimes allowed to produce cider for his own personal use and for that of his family and friends. That was enjoyed in his off time.
So we have several questions about kind of your knowledge on the descendants of some of the families that you've traced and presented here today. I mean, have you made contact with any of the descendants? Do you know if any still are living in Massachusetts that, again, you've been in touch with or worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. The Toby Talbot's family, I know of, still has descendants living today in Massachusetts that we've corresponded in the past with. The Parting Ways research in the 70s had revealed I believe that 2 of the families did not have descendants to the present day, and 2 of the families did have lines to the present day. In one branch of the family, the descendants were invited. They attended some of the bicentennial events and still to this day identify as Black. That branch became, once they moved away from Plymouth, they moved up into Boston's substantial Black community there. They have all sorts of firsts up in the mid 1800s there. I think there's a few of the granddaughters and great granddaughters are, the first, receive some of the first Black college degrees, become important Black teachers, lead a lot of the Black abolitionist movement up there. Another branch of the family, and this is in Plato Turner's family, who Plato himself was Black and his wife Rachel was white. Some of his children marry white spouses, and then after a generation or two, continued to marry into Irish families, and then they moved down to Connecticut, and once in Connecticut, they begin passing as white, and so their descendants are white. So obviously Black history is there's a lot more work to be done, I think, today to be connecting. HistGen has the Georgetown University project going on right now, that is specifically dedicated to outreaching to the descendants of the enslaved people who were sold off to fund Georgetown's university's early funding. And I think that there's a lot of inspiration there in that project for connecting modern day descendants to these stories, because as important as it is to share these stories just generally for the broader public, I think it's very important for descendants specifically of the families to be connected. A lot of times some bits of oral history still connect back that can be found, but other times, slavery generated a lot of trauma, and so sometimes the stories just don't survive and aren't passed down. So I think that's a great question.
Thank you, Mary. Now, David asks, in reference to the website that you noted, Whose Land Do I Live On, which is native-land.ca, is that site Is that site only for Massachusetts area, or is that for the entire United States, or does it include
That's
Canada?
for all of, yeah, that's for all of North America. I think the indigenous folks who run it are based out of Canada, but they are constantly asking for updates from native tribes, particularly, sometimes additional land boundaries are discovered even as native tribes negotiate the legal boundaries, and so it's always being updated. And then tribes are regularly contributing new links if new websites associated to their history are being attached to it. So it's a great resource.
Great. Let's see. Mary Ellen asks, do you know if there were any familial ties between Cuffy Wright and Paul Cuffy?
Oh, Cuffy Wright's origins are less known. He is referred to in one record as Cuffy the African, and that's really the only clue to his origins, and that's not always a great clue to start out with, because while sometimes it can be a specific nod to actually being from Africa, a lot of times this word was just used as a substitution for the word black. So Paul Cuffy himself, though, his father was an African slave, and his mother was a Wampanoag woman. So no, the name Cuffy is just often applied, usually by white masters, as sort of as a generic slave name, but then additionally, there can sometimes be linguistic roots within African linguistics. So it's not always a strong clue when common slave names are in use if there's necessarily a connection. It's useful as a place to start, but absolutely in my work, sort of identifying the origins of each slave, a lot of times you can find a record that starts in the middle of a slave's life, and working backwards is always the challenge. But New England has the benefit of, New England, while they did not necessarily create a lot of specific legal or organizational structures around specifically noting slave records, slave vital records were typically kept as just a part of Massachusetts' broader requirements to record vital records to town clerks and within churches. So a lot of times I was able to link back multiple generations of families through just the records that were there in the files. So.
And we're almost at time, but just maybe one more question. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about, and you've kind of referenced this throughout the presentation, but how common was Black home ownership after the war? And then kind of what happened to freed slaves who had no money or who were not granted freedom dues, like Cuffy Wright, the example that you gave, who received some freedom dues at his manumission. So how common was Black home ownership? Maybe start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. At the time of the 1790 census, 1 in 4 Black people were living in free Black-owned households in which they owned their home and their wife and children were there. But therefore, 3 in 4 Black people in Plymouth County at the time of the census were living in white homes and basically living there as servants. And so with that abolition of slavery in 1783, there really weren't financial opportunities set up. There was no sort of structural system set up to support hundreds and thousands of slaves here in Massachusetts who were suddenly free, had spent a life in enslavement, and had no financial opportunities. So really, I mean, you can see in these early court records the sort of racist attitudes. There's a lot of concern about how slave masters would be reimbursed, and there's a lot of legal fights around their demands, but there's really not a lot of focus on actually setting up institutions and organizations to actually help the formerly enslaved people who are now starting out for freedom for the first time. So in some respects, women and children are always at a disadvantage, although a lot of Plymouth Black soldiers did serve in the war, especially towards the end of the war. Just so many soldiers were needed that even though slave owners were resistant to the threat of losing their slaves, basically the majority of adult Black men in Plymouth County served and therefore had the opportunity to purchase their freedom. But then really it was Black people doing the work for themselves. There are a lot in the 1790s and 1800s. There's a lot of Black community organizing. Boston is a bigger center a bit than Plymouth at the time, but there's a lot of ties between the Plymouth and Boston communities at this time of, trying to set up these sort of community loans, offering Black legal advice. And so the poverty is always a problem. James Easton's story is a remarkable story of Black joy as much as Black racism, but he is in many cases sort of an outlier rather than the average Black experience of poverty in the wake of the Revolutionary War. We talk a lot about the Reconstruction era of the Civil War, but essentially New England society undergoes this same process following the Revolutionary War. There's such great changes. There's sort of up in the air. There's a lot of legal battles that go on about what civil rights to Black New Englanders mean in the wake of the war. And unfortunately, it takes many, 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 many decades up to the present day for these structural systems to experience big changes to be more supportive to Black families. So.
Well, thank you again, Mary. And I know that there were several descendants listening today. A few people wrote in descendants of the Eastons, the Turners, Talbot, and I'm sure many others listening today. And there were some questions about, some more specific questions. Again, I just wanted to put up Mary's contact information. If you do have some questions, she has a fantastic blog that you can follow, and also reach out to her with some other questions. And also there were some other questions about your book and when it's coming out. So that will be available late summer of this year. That will be available on our website, AmericanAncestors.org. We are publishing Mary's work, and that should be available later this year. So again, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. If you have more specific questions about your family history research, you may consider hiring our research services team. You can learn more by contacting the email address on your screen. And then I do want to let you know about a recent expansion of our free online chat service. So you can actually chat live with our genealogists Monday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This service is open to everyone, and it can be accessed at americanancestors.org/chat. And I will be including much of this information in my follow-up email to you later today, as well as a link to the recording of this session. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback as we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more educational opportunities for you and for others. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.